A lot of people were convinced this moment would pass. That Caitlin Clark was just another viral phase. A hot season. A college storyline that would cool off the second real adversity showed up. They were waiting for the hype to die. They were waiting for the numbers to dip, for the attention to move on, for the conversation to shift back to normal. And when she went down with an injury, a lot of those people quietly smiled. Because in their minds, this was it. This was the natural reset. No games. No highlights. No nightly box scores. No reason for casual fans to stay locked in. But something strange happened instead. While Caitlin Clark wasn't even on the court, her influence didn't stall. It didn't slow. It didn't shrink. It multiplied. In fact, some of the biggest signs that Caitlin Clark fever is about to completely explode didn't come from a gym, a broadcast, or a scoreboard at all. They came from places most fans never think to look. Quiet industries, executive decisions, money movements that usually happen far away from public hype. And once you see these signs stacked together, it becomes impossible to unsee what's coming next. Because this story isn't about basketball anymore. It's about leverage. It's about attention. And it's about what happens when one athlete becomes bigger than the system built around them. And it all starts with the moment that was supposed to slow everything down, but did the exact opposite. When Caitlin Clark got hurt, the narrative wrote itself. At least, that's what everyone thought. No games meant no momentum. No court time meant no conversation. And in sports, absence usually equals irrelevance. That's how it's always worked. Stars disappear when they stop playing. Fans move on. Media finds the next shiny thing. Even legends fade when they're not actively performing. We've seen it over and over again, across every major sport. But Caitlin didn't follow that script. Instead of vanishing from the spotlight, she became harder to escape. Her name kept showing up. Her presence kept dominating conversations. And somehow, while she was watching games instead of playing in them, her footprint across the sports world actually grew. That's not normal. In fact, it's the first major signal that Caitlin Clark operates under a completely different set of rules. Because when an athlete's relevance increases without performance, it means their value is no longer tied to results alone. It means they've crossed into something far more powerful, cultural gravity. People weren't tuning in for what she was doing anymore. They were tuning in because of what she represents. Think about that shift for a second. The injury removed the one thing critics always cling to, stats. And without box scores to argue over, something else became impossible to ignore. The attention didn't need proof. It didn't need justification. It existed on its own. That's when the tone changed. Instead of asking whether Caitlin Clark was still the biggest draw in women's basketball, people started asking a much bigger question. Why does everything around her feel louder, bigger, and more valuable, even when she's not playing? That question started quietly. Analysts danced around it. Media softened the language. But behind the scenes, people who make decisions for a living were already adjusting their expectations. Because injuries usually pause a career. But in Caitlin's case, the injury revealed something deeper. It exposed how much of the modern women's basketball ecosystem was already orbiting around her. Ticket demand, media coverage, social engagement, merch interest. All of it stayed elevated, even without weekly appearances. And that's when it became clear. The Caitlin Clark effect isn't dependent on performance cycles. It's independent. That realization alone would have been shocking. But what happened next pushed the conversation into territory nobody was prepared for. Because while fans were still arguing about basketball takes online, a completely different world had already started responding. A world that doesn't care about highlight reels. A world that follows money instead of narratives. And that's where the Real story begins. While most fans were focused on injury updates and return timelines, something else was happening quietly in the background. No press conferences. No viral clips. No ESPN debates. Just numbers. And not the kind you see on a scoreboard. PSA, the company that grades trading cards and sets the gold standard for the entire collectibles industry, released its annual data. This isn't social media hype. This isn't fan polls. This is hard, transactional behavior. People paying real money, sending real assets, expecting long-term value. And when the data dropped, it caught almost everyone off guard. Caitlin Clark became the #1 most collected active basketball player in the world. Not women's basketball. Not rookies. Not college athletes. Basketball. Period. She passed every active NBA player. She passed MVPs, champions, faces of franchises. She passed LeBron James. And here's the part that makes this impossible to dismiss. She did it while injured, while not playing, while not adding a single new highlight to the catalog. That doesn't happen by accident, because the trading card world isn't emotional. It's predictive. Collectors don't chase what's popular today. They chase what they believe will matter tomorrow. It's one of the earliest markets to detect long-term cultural icons, because money moves faster than media narratives. And the map PSA released made it even clearer. State by state, across the entire country, Caitlin Clark cards were being graded more than anyone else's. Not close, not competitive, dominant. Entire regions were sending in her cards at a higher rate than any other basketball player alive. That kind of saturation tells a very specific story. It means interest isn't localized. It isn't regional. It isn't tied to one fanbase or one moment. It's national, border to border. And more importantly, it's durable. Even more telling, 3 of the 10 most graded cards across all sports belong to Caitlin Clark. Not basketball. All sports. Football. Baseball. Everything. That's not fandom. That's belief. And when you zoom out, the timeline makes this even more uncomfortable for skeptics. The year before, she was already near the top. But the jump she made during the season she barely played, that's the part no one can explain away. PSA's own president didn't sugarcoat it. He made it clear this level of momentum only appears with the rarest athletes, the ones who don't just succeed, but define eras. At that point, the conversation shifted again. Because once you dominate a market that exists purely to predict future value, you stop being viewed as a player. You start being treated like an asset, a brand, a long-term bet. And that's exactly when a certain type of person starts paying attention. Not fans, not analysts, executives. The people who don't chase hype, they chase inevitability. And once they noticed what was happening around Caitlin Clark, the bets that followed raised eyebrows everywhere. Here's the part of the story that doesn't trend on social media, but quietly moves entire industries. When regular investors believe in something, they talk about it. When executives believe in something, they buy. No interviews, no hype, just paperwork and signatures. And that's exactly what started happening. In late 2025, filings revealed that Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, purchased a massive block of Nike stock. Not through some complex fund, not through a hedge. His own money. That detail matters more than people realize. Tim Cook doesn't chase speculative plays. He doesn't need risky upside. He runs one of the most valuable companies in human history. His job is stability, not gambling. When someone like that makes a direct investment into a brand that's been struggling, it sends a message without saying a word. It means something has changed. Because Nike wasn't riding high at that moment. The brand had been losing momentum for years. Stock price down. Innovation questioned. Younger brands eating away at its cultural relevance. Analysts were openly asking whether Nike had lost its edge. That's the context most people miss. So when Tim Cook stepped in, it wasn't optimism, it was confidence. The kind of confidence that comes from seeing a future others haven't priced in yet. And then came the second signal. Nike's own CEO followed suit. Elliott Hill purchased roughly $1 million worth of Nike stock himself. Again, not quietly through bonuses or compensation packages. Straight up buying. That's not symbolic. That's conviction. Because CEOs don't buy stock in their own company unless they know something fundamental is about to shift. If the ship is sinking, they don't jump in deeper. They step back. They protect themselves. They move cautiously. But Hill did the opposite, which immediately raised a question that no press release could answer. Why now? The answer didn't come in words. It came in timing. Nike's North American business started showing signs of life. After years of decline, revenue ticked up. Growth returned. Not explosive, yet, but undeniable. Enough to confirm that the rebound wasn't theoretical anymore. And buried inside that rebound was a name that kept surfacing in internal conversations, marketing strategy, and long-term planning. Caitlin Clark. Not as an endorsement, not as a spokesperson, but as a pivot point. This is where people misunderstand how corporations think. Brands like Nike don't bet on athletes, they bet on cultural shifts. And what they were seeing wasn't just viewership or jersey sales. It was a gravity change, a new center forming around which attention, spending, and loyalty could rotate. Caitlin represented something Nike desperately needed: relevance that felt organic, unavoidable, and future-facing. And while the public was still arguing about shoe delays and rollout mistakes, the people at the top were already positioning themselves for what comes next. Because once CEOs start aligning their money with a narrative, it means the decision has already been made. The only question left was how it would be executed. And that brings us to the moment when frustration boiled over. Not behind closed doors, but in full view of the public. By the time Caitlin Clark's name started surfacing in executive conversations, Nike was already under real pressure. Not the loud kind of pressure that comes from one bad quarter, but the slow, dangerous kind. The kind where a brand realizes it might be losing its identity. For decades, Nike didn't just sell shoes. It dictated culture. It decided what was cool, who mattered, what the future of sport looked like. But somewhere along the way, that dominance softened. Younger consumers weren't waiting for Nike drops anymore. Smaller brands were moving faster. Trends were shifting quicker than Nike's release cycles. What once felt cutting edge started to feel predictable. And then came the moment that made the tension impossible to hide: the Caitlin Clark signature shoe delay. From the outside, it looked like a simple rollout issue. Production timelines, marketing strategy, corporate logistics, all the usual explanations. But fans didn't see it that way. To them, it felt like another miss. Another example of Nike not understanding the moment it was standing in. Caitlin Clark wasn't just the most talked-about name in women's basketball. She was the biggest draw in the sport, full stop. People wanted something tangible, something they could buy into. And when it didn't happen, frustration boiled over. The comparisons started immediately. Why was another athlete getting priority? Why was Nike moving so slowly? Why did it feel like the company was out of sync with its own audience? Online, the criticism grew louder by the day. But internally, the response wasn't panic, it was recalibration. Because Nike didn't misread Caitlin's value. If anything, they understood it better than most. What they underestimated was the speed at which the public expected action. And that disconnect created a rare moment where perception and strategy briefly collided. Here's the part most people missed. Nike wasn't delaying because Caitlin wasn't important. They were delaying because she was too important to rush. Signature shoes don't just represent an athlete. They represent a direction, a philosophy, a bet on the future. And if Nike was going to attach Caitlin Clark's name to a product, it couldn't be just another release. It had to mean something. That's why the backlash didn't trigger a scramble. It triggered patience. Nike understood that once this shoe dropped, there would be no going back. It wouldn't just reflect Caitlin. It would reflect Nike's ability to still shape the culture instead of chasing it. Behind the scenes, the conversation wasn't about, when can we launch? It was, how do we get this right? Because this wasn't about short-term sales anymore. This was about reclaiming relevance. And then Caitlin herself stepped into the conversation. Not with a complaint, not with pressure, but with a statement that quietly confirmed everything Nike was planning. When she spoke about her involvement in the shoe, about being picky, about performance, about wanting something that matched or exceeded the best technology she'd ever worn, it sent a very specific signal. This wasn't a vanity project. This wasn't a logo swap. This was a build. She wasn't just lending her name. She was shaping the product. And that changed how people inside the industry interpreted the delay. Suddenly, it wasn't a stumble. It was a setup. Because when an athlete starts talking about unseen technology, about features that haven't been revealed, about excitement without specifics, that's when the marketing machine is warming up. Nike wasn't dragging its feet. It was loading the launch. And once that realization set in, the focus shifted again. Away from frustration. Away from delays. Toward anticipation. Because the real impact of Caitlin Clark's rise wasn't going to be felt in a press release or a factory. It was going to be felt the moment she stepped back onto the court, with everything aligned behind her. This is where the story stops being speculative and starts feeling intentional. When Caitlin Clark finally spoke publicly about her signature shoe, she didn't hype it the way athletes usually do. There were no buzzwords, no forced excitement, no sales pitch disguised as confidence. Instead, she talked like someone who knew exactly what was coming and wasn't in a rush to explain it. She mentioned grip. She mentioned feel. She mentioned how certain shoes never quite did what she needed them to do. And then she said something that instantly separated this project from every other signature rollout in recent memory. She said whatever went into her shoe needed to be the equivalent of the best technology she'd ever worn, or better. That sentence mattered, because Caitlin Clark isn't known for exaggeration. She's known for precision, for control, for understanding details most people overlook. When someone like that says better, it's not marketing language. It's a standard. And notice what she didn't do. She didn't reveal the tech. She didn't tease the look. She didn't give timelines. That silence wasn't accidental. In sneaker culture, secrecy creates gravity. The less you say, the more people speculate. And speculation is where demand quietly builds before it ever shows up on a balance sheet. Nike understands this better than almost anyone. Every era-defining shoe, Jordan's early releases, Kobe's evolution, even LeBron's reinventions, followed the same pattern. Delay, frustration, mystery, then detonation. What makes Caitlin's situation different is timing. This isn't a shoe launching during peak dominance. It's a shoe launching at the moment of return. At the moment when curiosity is already maxed out. When narratives are stacked. When the audience is waiting to see if the story continues or resets. That's the most dangerous moment to drop a product, and the most powerful. Because the shoe doesn't have to convince people Caitlin is great. It just has to show up. By holding back details, Nike created a vacuum. And in that vacuum, fans, analysts, and collectors filled in the blanks themselves. Performance-driven, built for range, designed for movement that doesn't exist in traditional molds. The expectations grew without Nike saying a word. That's leverage. And here's the part that most casual fans miss. Signature shoes aren't about footwear margins. They're about signaling relevance. When a shoe becomes unavoidable, everything around it rises. Jerseys, media deals, broadcast interest, youth engagement. It's an ecosystem play. And Caitlin's shoe isn't entering a neutral market. It's entering a moment where women's basketball is already fighting for long-term stability, attention, and respect. A successful launch doesn't just validate Caitlin. It reshapes how companies evaluate the entire space. That's why this rollout is careful. That's why it's slow. And that's why people inside the industry aren't asking if it will hit. They're asking how big the ripple will be. Because once Caitlin steps back onto the court wearing something built specifically for how she plays, the conversation won't be theoretical anymore. It'll be visual. It'll be measurable. And it'll be impossible to ignore. But as powerful as the shoe is, it's still just the spark. The Real explosion comes from what happened the last time she played, when the numbers exposed a truth the league had been avoiding. And that moment shattered every assumption about how big this could actually get. The clearest warning sign didn't come from a playoff game. It didn't come from a rivalry matchup. It didn't even come from a meaningful contest. It came from a game that wasn't supposed to matter at all. After months away, Caitlin Clark finally suited up. Not for a season opener, not for a title run, but for a preseason exhibition. A tune-up, a warm-up. The kind of game that usually passes without headlines or historical context. On paper, it was nothing. A scrimmage against a Brazilian national team. No stakes. No standings. No consequences. And yet, tickets vanished almost instantly. The arena sold out in minutes. That alone raised eyebrows. But what happened next forced executives, broadcasters, and advertisers to take a second look. Because the demand wasn't confined to the building. ESPN made a decision that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. They put it on national television. A preseason exhibition. And when the numbers came in, the illusion finally cracked. Over 1.3 million people tuned in to watch Caitlin Clark play in a game that technically didn't matter. No title implications. No pressure. Just the return. To understand why that number is so explosive, you have to compare it to what it outpaced. That single exhibition nearly matched, and in some cases rivaled, the viewership of the league's biggest games. Championship-level broadcasts. Finals matchups. Events that were supposed to represent the absolute peak of interest. And this wasn't even her season debut. That's when people started asking the question no one wanted to say out loud. If a preseason exhibition can pull numbers like this, what happens when it actually counts? The answer became even more uncomfortable when you factor in how ratings are measured. At the time, the league was transitioning into a new ratings methodology. One that captures more devices, more streams, more platforms. On paper, it inflates totals. makes growth look healthier. But that exhibition game was measured under the older system, which means the real audience was likely much larger than what was reported. That realization quietly changed how networks viewed risk. Missing a Caitlin Clark game suddenly became unacceptable. Executives weren't worried about oversaturating coverage anymore. They were worried about leaving numbers on the table. Because once audiences show they'll tune in without stakes, without narrative buildup, without marketing saturation, it means you're dealing with appointment viewing. People weren't watching because the game mattered. The game mattered because she was in it. That distinction changes everything. It explains why her first real game back drew massive attention. Why broadcasts treated routine matchups like events. Why casual fans, the hardest audience to capture, kept showing up. And it explains why predictions for her full return season began to sound almost absurd. Because if a preseason exhibition can flirt with finals-level numbers, then a true return, paired with a new shoe, a full offseason of hype, and a league now fully aware of what's at stake, isn't just bigger. It's structural. The infrastructure has to adjust. Networks schedule differently. Sponsors allocate differently. Coverage shifts from reactive to proactive. And once that happens, the league doesn't decide the ceiling anymore. The audience does. Which brings us to the moment when all of these threads, the injury, the collectibles, the executives, the shoe, the ratings, start pointing toward the same unavoidable conclusion. 2026 isn't just another season. It's the inflection point. By the time 2026 arrives, everything around Caitlin Clark will be aligned in a way we almost never see in sports. This isn't just a player returning from injury. This is a full ecosystem snapping into place at the same time. Think about what's converging. She's coming back healthy, which already creates one of the strongest narratives in sports. Comebacks don't need marketing. People instinctively lean in. They want to see if the magic is still there. They want to witness the first moment it reappears. But Caitlin's return won't be quiet. It won't be eased in. It will land with a full Nike machine behind it. Not the hesitant, confused version of Nike from the last few years, but a brand that has finally chosen its flag bearer and committed. That matters more than most people realize. When Nike goes all in, the sport doesn't just get ads. It gets visibility. It gets legitimacy. It gets inserted into places it's never been before. Digital feeds, physical spaces, youth pipelines, international markets. And Caitlin isn't entering that spotlight as a question mark. She's entering as proof. The league already has the data. Networks already have the numbers. Sponsors already know which games outperform expectations. There's no guesswork left. That's why every Caitlin game becomes non-negotiable television. Not because executives love basketball, but because missing those viewers is a business failure. You don't leave millions of eyeballs on the table when the formula is that clear. This is where the term appointment viewing stops being hype and starts being policy. Casual fans, the ones who don't follow standings, don't know rosters, don't care about league politics, they show up for moments. And Caitlin Clark has become a moment generator. That's why her games don't behave like normal broadcasts. Ratings don't spike gradually. They jump. They pull in people who weren't planning to watch anything at all. And that audience is the most valuable audience in sports. Because they don't just watch, they convert. They buy merch. They follow storylines. They stick around longer than expected. By 2026, the league won't be asking whether Caitlin Clark is the biggest draw. It will be asking how to schedule, promote, and structure itself around her gravity without saying it out loud. And that's where tension starts to build. Because when one figure becomes that central, it exposes uncomfortable truths. About parity, about marketing priorities, about what actually drives growth versus what people wish drove growth. This isn't about jealousy. It isn't about teammates or rivals. It's about reality asserting itself. The moment Caitlin steps onto the court in 2026, with new tech on her feet, a comeback narrative in full swing, and a media machine already warmed up, the numbers will no longer be theoretical. They'll be undeniable. And once that happens, there's no walking the conversation back. But the most interesting part isn't what happens during the games. It's what happens after. Because when the season ends and the dust settles, the league will be forced to confront a question it's been quietly avoiding the entire time. What happens when one player becomes bigger than the structure built to contain them? That's where this story stops being about growth and starts being about control. This is the point where the conversation gets uncomfortable. Because once all the numbers are laid out, the ratings, the merchandise, the collectibles, the executive bets, the sponsorship gravity, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Caitlin Clark isn't just elevating the league. She's carrying it. And there's a difference between those two things that people are reluctant to acknowledge. When a league grows evenly, attention spreads. Multiple stars share responsibility. Interest feels balanced. But when growth accelerates around one figure, the structure starts bending toward them, whether anyone wants it to or not. That's what's happening here. Look at how conversations form. Which highlights dominate feeds. Which games get promoted weeks in advance. Which matchups suddenly become must-watch. The league doesn't say her name out loud when making these decisions, but the outcomes say it for them. Because Caitlin Clark doesn't just attract existing fans. She pulls in people who weren't watching at all. People who don't know standings. Don't follow storylines. Don't care about league politics. That's rare. Most leagues grow by nurturing diehards. Caitlin grows the audience sideways. Into pop culture, mainstream sports discussion, and casual attention. That kind of growth is messy. It's unpredictable. And it doesn't distribute itself evenly, which is why it creates friction. Some people want to believe the league's success is structural. That systems matter more than individuals. That no one player should ever be bigger than the whole. In theory, that sounds right. In reality, history disagrees. Every major sports leap forward has been pulled by a singular force. Someone who breaks through the bubble and forces the outside world to pay attention. The leagues don't choose these figures, the audience does. And once the audience decides, everything else follows. That's the position Caitlin Clark now occupies. She doesn't need constant promotion because conversation forms around her naturally. She doesn't need controversy to stay relevant because attention sticks even in silence. She doesn't even need to play for interest to remain elevated. That's not normal stardom. That's cultural anchoring. And here's where the tension quietly builds behind the scenes. Because when one athlete becomes that central, the league faces a dilemma it can't openly address. Do you lean into it, knowing growth accelerates but balance erodes? Or do you resist it, knowing you might slow momentum in the name of optics? There's no clean answer. But what makes Caitlin's situation different is timing. This isn't happening at the peak of a long-established powerhouse league. It's happening during a fragile growth phase where every ratings cycle matters, every sponsorship negotiation matters, and every broadcast decision ripples outward. That gives her leverage without her ever asking for it. Not because she demands it, but because attention defaults to her. And that's why so many narratives orbit around minimizing, redistributing, or reframing her impact. Not out of malice, but out of fear of imbalance. But the numbers don't care about comfort. They care about behavior. And behavior has been consistent. When Caitlin Clark is involved, interest spikes. When she isn't, the conversation struggles to sustain the same volume. That doesn't mean other players don't matter. It means gravity isn't equal. And gravity never is. Which brings the story full circle. Because what started as hype, then skepticism, then irritation, has quietly turned into something much more definitive. Inevitability. And now the only thing left is the moment when all of this stops being discussed and starts being experienced. That moment is coming next. This was never about one hot season. It was never about highlights, records, or debate segments. It was about signals. Signals that showed up while Caitlin Clark wasn't even playing. Signals hidden in money movement, audience behavior, and quiet executive decisions. Signals that all point to the same conclusion. This moment was building long before most people realized it. The injury didn't slow her down. It exposed how much attention no longer depends on performance alone. The collectibles didn't just spike, they predicted belief. The CEOs didn't just invest, they positioned early. The shoe delay wasn't hesitation, it was preparation. And the ratings didn't climb, they warned. By the time 2026 arrives, none of this will feel surprising anymore. People will say they saw it coming. They'll call it inevitable. They'll act like the explosion was always obvious. But it wasn't. It only becomes obvious after it happens. Because when Caitlin Clark steps back onto the court with everything aligned, the comeback narrative, the Nike machine, the audience already waiting, the conversation won't be about whether she's the biggest draw. It'll be about how far ahead she already is. And what happens next won't just define her career. It will define how women's basketball is viewed, marketed, and valued moving forward. So if you want to stay ahead of this moment instead of reacting to it after the fact, make sure you're subscribed. Because this story isn't ending here. It's just entering the part everyone will be talking about.